Hi there, I'm Diane Callahan, developmental editor and YouTuber quotidian writer. I'm here today with Casey Norton, one of the many talented writers on the Story Garden team, and perhaps the most prolific as well. And she's written 4 books in the Unwedding Vow series, in addition to the fantasy novels The Tale of the Hidden Village, as well as The Stone Dragon and The Moonshine Molly. So today we're here to talk about creating swoon-worthy male leads in romance novels. And so the Unwedding Vow series, so we have the first book here in broad strokes, and these are all standalone rom-coms, and they're connected by the fact that all the characters have gone to this terrible wedding and vowed to never get married. But of course, one by one, they all fall victim to their hearts, and they find somebody to love. And so we have 4 books in the series out right now, and so what I find really interesting is how Kat has written the male love interest in these stories, since they're all third person with dual POV. And personally, I think they're all really realistic as characters and as romance leads, and they're all really swoon-worthy in unconventional ways in some respects, I feel. But yeah, so do you want to talk a little bit about the hero in broad strokes, the first book?
Tyler is very anxious, which is kind of a problem since his nude portrait has been sent to New York City to be displayed in a giant gallery.
Yes.
Kind of against his wishes.
Exactly. And I think what makes him a really good lead, too, is that he's like a soft boy personality, which is kind of makes him really vulnerable. And he's kind of like a wounded animal that you want to help heal. So I think that's really endearing. And then the second book is Under a Big Top. So that's our circus themed one.
Yep.
And then the hero of that one is
a guy who's trying to run a circus. His name's Dalton, and the circus is doing its best to fail. Everything that can go wrong does go wrong. There's an oiled man firing himself out of a cannon. There are there's clown drama. We got it all.
Got it all. And I like that Dalton is very much the larger than life personality, which makes he's the ring master, and that makes a lot of sense too for
yes, pretty much any situation where he can stand up and bring the drama.
Be the showman, exactly. And then the pinball and chain is probably my favorite of the heroes so far, because he's like a lumberjack type. But like, how would you describe him?
Vic basically has built a small cabin way out in the middle of nowhere, and has only his dog for company, and is pretty happy with that. He's a bachelor, he's got 1 fork, 1 chair, 1 plate.
I know. I don't know, but he's such a sweetheart too. That's what I love about it, is that he's very simple, makes his own furniture type of guy. And then the 4th book in the series is Some Strings Attached, and so that one's between a rock star and then the bus driver, a per tour bus driver,
yes. who is trying to steal his family's unlucky guitar back from her after it proves to be lucky for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that he is sort of the wounded hero type, and that he's really he doesn't really want to steal it. He doesn't want to have to do that, but he feels sort of compelled to and guilty about it.
It's definitely one of those not wanting to have to admit you did something wrong, so you just try to figure out how to fix it, but just make it worse constantly.
Yes, but I don't know. I really like him too. Oz is definitely one of my other favorites from it. So I think that they are all swoon-worthy men in one way or another, and they're just... But it's also the fact that they kind of confront their own anxieties, and they have their own emotional struggles. And so I really wanted to talk about the creation process of those characters and sort of the gender dynamics in romance, especially because I think they are sort of unconventional when it comes to male heroes, but also realistic too. So the first question I have for you is, for you, what's the most important thing in writing a male lead in a romance novel?
I get really frustrated when I'm reading stuff where the male lead, male love interest, the male lead is just, the thing about him is that he's hot. That really drives me crazy. So for me, I have to figure out something that makes me fall in love with them a little bit, right? I feel like for all of the characters, you have to really want them to get together, and you also have to like them as individuals. So it's partly figuring out how they kind of balance each other, and also their willingness to confront their own insecurities or whatever their problems are, so that it's not just they're being fixed or something by the other character. I mean, I think that goes for both, both characters.
I agree, but I love that, because I think that's a really important thing, is that they're not there to just save the heroine, or just they're not there to be fixed, like you said. It's not about that. They are their own person, independent of the love interest, and I think that's really wonderful. But yeah, so for you, like, how is writing male leads in romance different from other genres you write, like fantasy?
Um, if we're talking about something other than romance, because we do have, Stone
Fantasy
Dragon
romance.
is a romance as well. But I feel more comfortable with things that aren't romance, with characters that have a lot of unresolved.
Mhm.
They're not confronting their own stuff. Because I don't like when I don't root for characters to get together when they're not interested in solving their own problems. For other genres, I do science fiction, I do fantasy and stuff as well. And then those characters can be a lot more flawed and a lot more problematic. And I still want them to work on their problems. But I feel like for romance they have to be farther through that, or at least acknowledging their problems, because otherwise it's just like you need to work your stuff out before you can.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, because I think, I was about to say, like, oh yeah, if the male hero is murdering a bunch of people, that might not be very appealing, but I guess in like a mafia romance or something that might work out. But no, that's definitely true. So how do you think about the dynamic between these couples in sort of a heteronormative kind of relationship? Like, how do you approach writing that in an authentic way?
Well, for me, I feel like you have to fall, like I said before, you have to fall in love with each of the characters individually a little bit, and then actually root for them to get together. So, one of the things that frustrates me in romance novels that I read is when the characters, like, the only thing that's drawing to get together is like chemistry, right? Which is you kind of have to take the author's word for it. You can't necessarily see it play out unless there's actually something going on between them that like would bring them together. So yeah, for me, it's like I want them to be specific enough that they feel like actual people and not just stereotypes or sorry, kind of very basic versions of people that just happen to be in a place where they're both hot and single.
Yeah, I think it's really important for them to exist as individuals with their own goals and their own sort of character arcs. And I think that all the characters in the Unwedding Vow series, like each half of the couple essentially has their own character arc and growth and things that they need to learn that the other person helps them learn, but they can't really solve their problems for them, right?
Yeah, or not necessarily recognize that they have something that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm,
a lot of, there's something like the enemies to lovers type thing, right? There's usually something about the character that they're not letting go of, for example. And so having the other person ends up making them confront something about themselves, and not forcing them to change. Like, oh, if you want to be with me, you have to change this. But like, hey, there's this thing that you kind of put off dealing with, for example.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. For sure. And I know that we do have like a male-male romance coming up in the series, but so the first 4 are like male-female pairings for now. But I was also wondering how much you draw on personal experience for writing these characters, the male leads in particular, because I think I remember you comparing yourself to Tyler and the dedication in Broad Strokes.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like for all the characters, I end up putting little, either stories about something that I've experienced or kind of parallels. Tyler, absolutely, his anxiety is very relatable for me. But I think so far with each of these books, there's been at least one scene where, one of the characters is like telling something about their life or trying to, it's like they're really talking about what's going on, but they're trying to give an example, like a parable kind of situation. And a lot of them have got, it's like, oh, okay, well, I had this experience. Maybe I could just like tweak it a little bit to fit them. Yeah, so probably.
Yeah. So do you think that Tyler is the one you're most similar to out of...
Probably Vic, actually.
Vic, really? Oh, yes, that's right. I think you did also say that, which is, I mean, Vic is the hottest, so this makes sense. So, so I think going off of that, like, what do you think that writers, regardless of their gender, they tend to get wrong in writing, romantic leads who are male identifying?
I get really frustrated whenever it's just gender stereotypes, right? I get, there are a lot of poor character choices that get written off as like, oh, it's just like boys being boys kind of thing, and that absolutely drives me crazy. So trying to figure out something that doesn't make them feel, I've had some people say, if you're reading a book and the male lead feels too feminine, right? Or it's like, because it's being a lot of the time being written by a female author, that the voice doesn't necessarily sound particularly masculine. Or it goes the opposite direction. It's this like weird, like toxic hypermasculinity. Yeah. So figuring out how to kind of balance like things that like fit with how the character behaved. How does the character behave with his friends? Like how does how does he interact with the world versus what he's thinking versus what he's doing, like, you know, having kind of layers to that and not just falling into the, you know, especially with anything like violence or anger, like immediate responses to things that sort of get written off, you know, red flag behaviors. You know, if you're going to have that in there, there has to be he has to really examine that for me.
Yeah. No, and I think that makes sense. And I think that there's a lot of times like male characters aren't really allowed to express different ranges of emotions.
Yeah.
And I think that's also something like to be able to have those insecurities and to kind of examine things beneath the anger and all that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot more, like when you kind of give your characters more freedom, they don't have to be like hyper analytical. But I think that it's like just because somebody doesn't analyze their emotions doesn't mean they don't feel them, I think is part of it too. So I think I agree that's really important to kind of just allow them to be human, essentially, which is the same advice that people give male writers when writing female characters. It's just like think of them as people, and like there's a really broad spectrum of the human experience. So there's no like one male kind of type, like, you know, like.
Well, and I think that's something with this series that I find really, you know, because the stories all do kind of link together, but they're all different ages, they all have different backgrounds, they all have different, there's not like a through line in terms of they're having the same emotional arc, right? So there's, you know, one character who is very male lead who is very, Dalton really wants to be in kind of control of things. I mean, that's literally his job. So it's not that he's too, you know, creepily controlling or anything, but he wants to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And so when he feels things kind of slipping away from him, that feels dangerous, right? So how does he deal with that? And how does he create a situation where he actually does have room in his life for a partner that actually takes on some of that workload, versus somebody like Tyler, you know, who's very the opposite. This is like not interested in being the center of attention, not interested in taking control of the situation. It's like, how does he figure out how to have more agency for himself and make decisions for what he wants based on what he hopes to achieve rather than what he's afraid of happening?
Yes, I know, that's so good. And I think something interesting about Tyler too, since he's in the first book, but then he also has cameos in the future books, and you kind of see his further character arc.
Yes,
because like I think in the first book, you're like at the end of it, you're like, oh, he's gonna really improve, but then in the next book, you really see him, you know, help other characters, and I think he like does karaoke or something like that.
Well, I was laughing when we got feedback. You know, when the first one had come out, someone was like, "Tyler really needs therapy," and I was like, "Tyler gets therapy in book 2. Like, don't worry about it."
Yeah, his art continues. Yeah, so that's what I really love about that too.
So, and yeah, we do. You know, spoiler, whatever. We do kind of check in with everybody at the end to kind of see everything. So we were just talking today about what we're subjecting poor Tyler to.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I love that. But so who is your favorite of the male leads in the Unwedding Vow that you've written, if you had to choose a favorite?
I'm sorry.
It is
I'm
Vic.
sorry everybody else
Everybody likes Vic. So yeah, that's Pinball and Chain, the third book, is what Vic is in. But yeah, there's just something magnetic about Vic because I think that he's just like, I don't know, he seems very confident and comfortable in himself. And
there were a lot of things in his arc that were things that I was going, oh, I really relate to this. And then I built my own house. Like I learned how to lay tile so that I could finish building my house. And I did, you know, there's a story that he tells in that about being on a road trip where, you know, he fell asleep thinking that one thing was happening. And when he woke up, he realized he was in a totally different place. And I was like,
wow,
that's immediately out of something that happened when I was living out of my car for 4 months and driving all over the country. So.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that. And also, I think the interesting with Vic is it's kind of like a dealing with his parental past and parental influence arc, which I don't think the other characters have as much. So, like, I think it's also sort of, it's an external / internal conflict with that. Yeah.
And he's a character who comes across, like, how people perceive him is very different from his internal life. Yes. So that's also one thing that he's a little bit more, because he's pretty reserved. That part I don't have in common with him, but but he holds a lot back. Mm-hmm. So when, you know, you kind of, it's like a duck, right, where you see like chill, calm Vic and like, oh, is he even paying attention? And then like occasionally when you get into his head, it's like, oh my God, what do I do?
Yes, exactly.
How do I fix this? Or having a moment where he is trying to be take control of the situation a little bit more, and it does not go well.
I know, but that's so endearing. I love that. I love like the kind of awkward moments by the well-meaning characters. I think that's really sweet.
So I think that was something different with, you know, I think Tyler doesn't necessarily come across as particularly like hyper masculine, but Vic is somebody who kind of, there's like almost conflicting layers to him once you're
Agree.
inside of his head of like it's not just the surface level thing or what other people perceive. He's having this whole other story going on.
Exactly. They assume he's really stoic, but he's actually a really warm person.
Yeah.
So yes, I think a lot of people could relate to that, honestly. But so my last question for you is kind of a heavy question. It's kind of a big question, but it's what is your philosophy of romance as a real life concept? Because I feel like that bleeds into fiction a bit too.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly it's funny to me how much I end up writing like very stereotypically like straight. I mean, I would say that they're not stereotypical characters, but in terms of the romance, a lot of, we're following a lot of tropes. Is very like, oh, you got to find that one person at age 28 and like that's your person forever, or what, or 80 is the cases and or whatever. But yeah, that kind of, there's kind of like a rigidity to the, I think, which is pretty common in romance novels, even not necessarily written by people who fall into that. But yeah, I think there are times where it's a little bit, for me, I have to make it feel like that's the character rather than just like the character is falling into the like, oh, well, I'm 30, so I got to find somebody or whatever, that it has to feel like, yeah, I mean, this is a person that this character actually wants to be involved with for, in this case, the rest of their life, since they're never getting married. But
yeah, because I think there is that feeling of like there's that not like anti-marriage sentiment, but there is like being against the marriage industrial complex, which all the characters are, but then their relationships are not really formed around that. Like you said, it's not this necessity of like I should get married or I'll be alone forever, but instead actually finding somebody that they want to be with. And
yeah, and that's one thing that was appealing to me about this series, that is not people going like, well, I got to find somebody, right? That it's like, no, I'm going to just go do my own thing, and I'm going to put this thing at the put my job at the center of my life, or put this particular interest at the center of my life, and like, okay, yeah, but then they accidentally end up falling for somebody, so it has to be that much more believable, because that's not what they're looking for.
Yes, exactly that. Yes, that's wonderful. And so yeah, I'm so glad we could talk about this and finally talk about the Unwedding Vow series. So you can buy our books on Amazon. We have print, we have ebook. I like the cover of Pen Ball and Chain where our beloved Vic resides. So I will show that one up. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll see everybody next time in our story garden.